What's up, everybody? Let's start reading through this reading assignment for the week. Follow along with me and do your best to answer the questions. All right, this one is about how do your genes get passed on? How can it how can children from the same parent look so different? Nature is absolutely amazing when it comes to reproduction. There is a system specifically designed to make all children different, and it has to do with your DNA. When we all have certain genes that we share with our families and relatives. A gene is a section of DNA that codes for something specific. All the genes in your DNA help to tell your body how to grow and operate. Our genes can also tell us about where our ancestors came from. This is genetic ancestry. Different versions of the same gene are called alleles. For example, a gene that codes for the stem color of fast plants could include an allele that causes purple stems or an allele that causes green stems. For every gene, you have two alleles. Because one set of alleles came from your mother and the other set of alleles came from your father. The combination of alleles you end up with for each gene will determine which traits you end up with. Some alleles are more strongly expressed than others. Some alleles, versions of genes, are strong enough to mask or overpower other alleles, making some traits more dominant than other traits. An allele that is strong enough to overpower other versions of a gene is called a dominant allele. Dominant traits tend to show up in a population more often than other traits because dominant alleles are expressed more strongly in individuals. Alleles that are not as strong and less likely to be expressed as a trait are called recessive alleles. In order for a recessive trait to show, an individual would need to have two copies of a recessive allele. That way, there are no dominant alleles to cover them up. So, what determines which alleles or which versions of all of your genes you will get from your parents? When a sperm and an egg join to create a new person, the sperm will contain only half the father's original chromosomes, when the egg cells will contain only half of the mother's original chromosomes. Each of these halves combine to make the whole you. But which half of each parent's chromosome gets chosen to pass on to their offspring? That is where nature does the especially amazing part. When forming sperm cells, the father's body randomly chooses genes from two halves of the father's chromosome. Just like a flipped coin has a 50-50 chance of landing heads or tails, you have about a 50-50 chance of inheriting either your father's alleles of each gene. You also have the same chance of inheriting either of your mother's alleles for each gene from her egg cell, a 50% chance of each allele. This means that even children from the same family will inherit a slightly different set of genetic material, or DNA, from each parent, and no two siblings will end up looking exactly alike. In fact, siblings only share about half the same DNA as one another. This shuffling around of genetic material when an egg and sperm combine during sexual reproduction is called genetic recombination. Because it is possible to carry certain alleles without expressing those traits, it's important in genetics to consider not only the traits we observe on the outside, but also the genes and alleles that we carry on the inside. The unique combination of two alleles that an individual has for each gene is called an individual's genotype. Whichever two alleles the individual has for a certain gene will affect which observable traits the individual ends up with. A phenotype is the observable trait that an individual has as a result of their genotype. So there's this way to know which genotype or phenotype an individual will have. Although genetic combination is random, we can predict the likelihood of certain traits getting passed on if we know which two alleles for a trait both parents have. Punnett squares are a useful tool that can be used to determine how likely it is for two parents with two known alleles to have offspring with those traits. A Punnett square is a four-square grid with the mother's two alleles on one side of the grid and the father's two alleles on the other side. Inside the grid are all the possible ways that those alleles could combine. Take a look at the Punnett square below. We have parent 1 with two recessive alleles, parent 2 with one dominant and one recessive. I'm not reading from the reading right now because I only have 19 seconds, but this last paragraph, you can do it. In the middle of the Punnett square, we can see the combinations of these alleles and what traits will be shown. So these letters are the genotype. These eye color is the phenotype. You've got this. Enjoy the rest of the reading. Don't forget to answer